Dashidilek, welcome to the weekly edition of Tibet This Week. We bring you news on Tibet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration. Let's look at the headlines first. His Holiness the Dalai Lama congratulates the new Prime Minister of Finland, Petteri Orpo. Sikyong Penpa Tsering says China under Xi Jinping is insecure. Tibetan Parliamentary Tibet Advocacy campaign underway in Europe. World marks 25th International Day in support of victims of torture. Department of Information and International Relations makes urgent call on China to stop torture in Tibet. Forced boarding schools by China in Tibet raised at 53rd UN Human Rights Session. Canadian parliamentarians call for sanctions against Chinese officials over coercive boarding schools in Tibet. Representatives of offices of Tibet meet to strengthen regional coordination. Tibetans of Washington urge Representative Susan Dalbany to support U.S. Tibet bill. Delegation of Chief Representative Office, South India pays courtesy call on Karnataka's Minister of Housing. Bharat Tibbat Samanvay Sangh holds National Executive Meeting. On Friday last week, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has congratulated Petteri Orpo on assuming the office of Prime Minister of Finland. His Holiness wished the new Prime Minister success in meeting the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in fulfilling the hopes and aspirations of the people of Finland, as well as contributing to a more peaceful and compassionate world. On Saturday last week, His Holiness the Dalai Lama presided over the inaugural of annual Mahaguru Bumtsok prayer ceremony, the offering to Guru Padmasambhava at the main temple in Dharamshala. Every year, the Department of Religion and Culture CTA, with assistance and support from Namgyal Monastery, organizes this prayer for the good health and long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and for quick resolution of Tibet issue. This week, His Holiness the Dalai Lama granted an audience to a group of Indian ladies representing ladies' organization from Calcutta-based Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and a group of monks and laypersons from Kamrao Tibetan settlement. After successfully concluding his maiden visit to New Zealand and Australia, Sikyong Penpa Tsering on Tuesday this week delivered the keynote address at the inaugural of the Conference on China's Tibet Policy under Xi Jinping, organized by the Center for China Analysis and Strategy at the India International Center in New Delhi. Sikyong remarked that the overall vision of Xi Jinping is to have one nation, one culture and one language at the expense of all other nationalities inside Tibet. Sikyong also said that despite having all the control and power to one person, China today under Xi Jinping is insecure. Sikyong also reiterated on the importance of international community to recognize the historical status of Tibet as an independent state and urged the global community to cease calling Tibet part of the People's Republic of China and thereby legitimizing China's occupation of Tibet.
If there is a solution to the Sino-Tibet conflict through the middle way policy, I believe that this would have much more implications in South and Southeast Asia, because Tibet borders with many countries in Southeast and South Asia. And Tibet traditionally has played the role of a buffer between the two most populous nations in the world. Some people who don't know about Tibet think Tibet is so small like Bhutan. But Tibet is huge. Tibet is 2.5 million square kilometers. It's about 1/4 of China's total landmass, and 18 times the size of Japan, 10 times the size of UK, or 1/3 of Australia, or maybe 60% of India's geographical area. So Tibet is huge. That is why Tibet historically has played the role of a buffer. Now, if there is a peaceful solution to the Sino-Tibet conflict, then I also believe that the Sino Indian border or the Indo-Tibetan border should also be resolved. So if that is resolved, then there can be more peace between the two Asian chains, India and China.
The one-day conference in Delhi includes researchers' presentation on China's recent activities in Tibet and religion, ethnic and environment policy in Tibet. A parliamentary delegation consisting of parliamentarians Khenpo Jambel Tinzin, Lopen Thupten Gyaltsen and Dojit Setin commenced their official visit to Europe, beginning with Belgium. The delegates on Wednesday this week called upon members of European Parliament Thomas Dikowski from the Czech Republic and appealed to the members of European Parliament to raise the issue of Tibet-China conflict in the European Parliament and to adopt resolution on Tibet. Members of European Parliament Thomas Dikowski affirmed his support for the Tibetan freedom movement. The delegation will continue their Tibet advocacy in Belgium till July 2nd. Secretary Tile Wangdi of the Office of Tibet, Brussels, attended the 15th founding anniversary of Zurich Sikyong's Jamyang Lopel Tibetan Language and Culture School and His Holiness the Dalai Lama's 88th birthday in Antwerpen on Saturday last week. The UN and Human Rights Desk of the Department of Information and International Relations, the Central Tibetan Administration, called on the Chinese Communist Party to stop torture in Tibet, coinciding with 25th International Day in support of victims of torture, as proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1997. Department of Information and International Relations Human Rights Desk stated the widespread of tortures in Tibet under the Chinese authorities against the Tibetan dissidents in and out of the Chinese jails and called on the CCP to stop torture in Tibet and release Tibetan political prisoners. Since 2008 nationwide uprising in Tibet, there has been reportedly at least 50 known cases of deaths of Tibetans as a result of torture in the hands of Chinese authorities. On Thursday this week, the concerns over China's continued violation of human rights, particularly forced boarding schools in Tibet, were raised in the ongoing 53rd UN Human Rights Council session. During an interactive dialogue with Special Rapporteur on Education under Item 3 of the UN Human Rights Council session, the United States Ambassador to United Nations Human Rights Council, Michelle Taylor, commended the UN Special Rapporteur on Education for bringing attention to Chinese government-run boarding schools in Tibet. Welcoming the Special Rapporteur's report on the right to education, on behalf of the Society for Threatened Peoples, the UN Advocacy Officer of the Tibet Bureau Geneva, Kaldin Somo, called for UN Human Rights Council's attention on colonial-style boarding schools run by the Chinese government in Tibet.
China has forcibly closed down private schools that are teaching Tibetan language and culture. Nearly 1 million Tibetan children aged 6 to 18 are separated from their parents and community and forced into colonial-style boarding schools. The UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, in its concluding observations in February this year, has raised serious concerns in this regard and has called on China to abolish boarding schools and to allow private schools to operate in Tibetan areas. A group of special rapporteurs, including Special Rapporteur on Education yourself, have raised similar concerns and recommendations. We reiterate these calls and urge Council's attention on the same.
Canadian House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development has called on its government to utilize the Special Economic Measures Act to sanction the Chinese government officials responsible for the implementation of the residential boarding school and preschool system in Tibet, including the Provincial Party Secretary in Tibet and the architects responsible for designing and implementing the residential boarding school system. In the report presented to the House of Commons by the Subcommittee on International Human Rights, the parliamentarians made an 18-point recommendation that also includes the prohibition of investment in dealings with entities involved in human rights abuses in Tibet, such as the ones supplying equipment and technology for the residential boarding school and mass illegal collection of Tibetan DNA samples in Tibet. The report also urged the government of Canada to appoint a special coordinator for Tibet and continue to fund the enhancement of education and resilience of Tibetans in India and Nepal. The Office of Tibet London brought together all the Tibet-related organizations of Tibetan community groups and Tibet support groups to reinforce the sense of belongingness and ownership of the Tibetan freedom movement. The three-day meeting was attended by Representative Sonam Frasi, Representative Tile Chuki, and Representative Rinzing Kingang of the offices of Tibet, London, Geneva, and Brussels. Additional Secretary Tenzin Lekshi of the Department of Information and International Relations, Central Tibetan Administration also attended the meeting and spoke about the relevance of Tibet issue for humanity and the complexities of Pan-Europe strategy on Tibet advocacy. A Tibet talk was held at the Swedish Parliament in the presence of Swedish members of Parliament Margareta Cederfelt and Richard Jomshoff and Dr. Martin Mills of Aberdeen University. The three-day meeting was attended by 28 participants within the Office of Tibet London constituency. On Thursday last week, the Tibetan Association in Washington conducted a virtual meeting to build public relations with United States local representatives in the Seattle area. The meeting brought together 8 delegation members from the Seattle Tibetan community, including 3 members of the voluntary Tibet Advocacy group, to meet with Kelly Marquardt, District Director for Representative Susan Dalbany in the 1st District. The delegation appealed Representative Susan Dalbany to support H.R. 533, promoting a resolution to the Tibet-China Conflict Act, which was introduced into Congress on 26 January this year by Representative Jim McGovern and Representative Michael McCall. The members of Seattle Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group and the Tibetan Association of Washington met with Andrew Hayes, field representative for Congressman Adam Smith, on 26 May this year. The delegation of the Chief Representative Office, South India, comprising Office Secretary Tenzin Sepil and Security Liaison Officer Kungaishi, paid a courtesy call on BZ Zamir Ahmad Khan, Minister of Housing, Work and Minority Welfare Department of Karnataka, on Tuesday this week at the latter's office. The delegation was also joined by representatives of Tashi Lumbu Monastery in Bailagupi and Dzongga Chöde Monastery in Hunsur. The Tibetan representatives congratulated the latter for the new government and his post and discussed Tibetan issues regarding minority grants, especially the present issue faced by Tashi Lumbu Monastery and Dzongga Chöde Monastery. The minister assured his utmost support to resolve problems faced by the both monasteries. The Tibetan delegation also attended a meeting to discuss India's law of commission that called for public opinion for the introduction of Uniform Civil Code in India. The meeting was attended by Shri Abdul Azim, Chairman, Karnataka State Minorities Commission. Bharat Tibbat Samanvay Sangh, one of the Tibet support groups in India, organized a 2-day summer national executive meeting in Sonipat, Haryana from Sunday last week. The inaugural session of the meeting was graced by the presence of Shri Om Prakash Dangar, State President, BJP Haryana, as the chief guest, and Shrimati Kavita Jain, former Cabinet Minister, Haryana Government, as the guest of honor. India-Tibet Coordination Office, New Delhi's Coordinator Tashi Digi and Program Officer Chunyin Tsering attended the meeting, joined by Regional Tibetan Women Association. More than 150 members of Bharat Tibbat Samanvay Sangh from all over India participated in the 2-day national executive meeting. That is all for this week. Thank you for watching Tibettv.